Trump has begun his second term with enormous energy and considerable force. His fundamental position is that for too long the rest of the world has been free riding on the United States, and Trump is saying, very understandably, this must stop.
2025 is a year of change. Cultural and political disruption is transforming our nation and the global order. The rebellion against the establishment has accelerated. Australia and the Western Alliance is now at a crossroads. Either the mainstream will continue its ascendancy or the elites will prevail. Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our viewers. Great to be back. Today we'll be discussing the upcoming election, Trump's tariffs, and the ongoing energy wars here in Australia. Tony, great to be back for another chat.
Dan, it's wonderful to be with you, and let's get into it.
Yes, well, let's continue where we sort of started last time, which was discussing the election and the campaign and how it's going. Since then, Albanese has given a pitch of sorts to the Australian people for why they should elect him for a second term, and basically he's saying everything's going well. Inflation's coming down, wages are going up, we've got your back, and trying to paint, I think, a fairly rosy picture of the situation here in Australia. I don't think that's going to quite land. I don't think it's really, marrying up to the lived experience of how people are going. So just interested in your perspective on essentially his pitch for a second term.
Well, thanks, Dan. There's absolutely no doubt that the election phony war is now in full swing. We are in the middle of an undeclared election campaign, and both leaders are very much out on the hustings. They might not admit it, but they are. You're right. I think there are two elements to Anthony Albanese's re-election pitch. The first is to tell us how wonderful the government's been. The second is to scare the bejesus out of us about Peter Dutton. I think there are two big problems with the government's pitch. The first is that things aren't wonderful, and they haven't been wonderful. We've had 7 successive quarters of negative growth per person. That's a household recession in anyone's language. The opposition says that in terms of real disposable income, after tax, after mortgage payments, etc., taking inflation and everything else into account, there's been a close to 9% decline in average living standards over the last 2.5 years. Now, that certainly is a bigger decline in living standards than at any time since the Great Depression. Now, I'm not saying that today's times are in any way analogous to the Great Depression. Obviously, we have far more material comforts. We have a well-developed social security system, so the kind of absolute poverty that you saw back then is not a feature of these times. But certainly the expectation that Australian families had for most of the post-war period, that they would do better and their children would do even better, is not something that can be taken for granted now. Our productivity has been poor. Real living standards have been pretty stagnant for the best part of a decade. In fact, our productivity today has fallen back to where it was about 5 years ago, we're told by the statisticians. And the government's only answer is to spend more, tax more, and regulate more, because this is a government with very old-fashioned big government instincts, and to the extent that there's anything that's not old-fashioned about this government, it's more recent green obsessions on things like climate. So that's problem number one with the government's pitch. It doesn't correspond with the lived reality of people who are in many cases paying $30,000 or $40,000 a year more just to keep their mortgage repayments up out of their after-tax income. It doesn't correspond, the government's rosy pitch, with the lived reality of millions and millions of Australians. And as for the negative pitch, well, I don't see what basis they've got for claiming that people are going to be thousands of dollars a year worse off with Peter Dutton. I mean, sure, the opposition have opposed some of the handouts that this government has made. They've certainly been sceptical about the general direction and the handout mindset of this government, with good reason. But the political reality is that once these handouts are in place, they can very rarely be taken back. And Peter Dutton has been at pains to stress that he's not going to cut these benefits, even if it was unwise of the government to offer them in the first place. So the other thing about Peter Dutton is that the earlier scare against Peter Dutton from the government was that he was a simple-minded Queensland cop, a bit of a brute, not very caring, not very compassionate. Well, I actually think that after 2.5 years of weak government, 2.5 years of a Prime Minister who really has often looked out of his depth, a bit of strength, a bit of confidence and a bit of certainty is actually what people want.
And we have to go back a long way, I think, to Howard, to when we had the same Prime Minister elected in 2 consecutive terms. And so while this argument is made that, well, you know, it's very ahistorical for a government to be turfed out of one term, it's certainly not ahistorical for a Prime Minister to be dispensed with after one term. And I think in the modern times where it's much more dynamic and fast moving, that, you know, the arguments of decades ago probably no longer apply. So, you know, my view is probably Peter Dutton's got his nose in front at the present moment. What do you think a government sort of needs to do to earn the votes to be returned a second time? Do you have to say people, well, this is what we said we do, this is what we've done, and this is what we're going to do for you next? How would you sort of present that to the people to convince them?
Well, essentially, that's right, Dan, but let me get back to that in a minute. Just let me say this. To get a majority in its own right, the coalition has to win 18 seats. And that is a big mountain to climb, no doubt about that. I actually won 18 seats in 2013, having won 7 seats in the previous election. And I wasn't campaigning against a government that had presided over 7 successive quarters of negative growth per person. I wasn't campaigning against a government that had helped to engineer and prolong a household recession. I wasn't campaigning against a government that had presided over a collapse in productivity and indeed an incredibly supine response to a massive wave of anti-Semitism, seriously damaging our social cohesion. So yes, 18 seats is a big ask, but this is a pretty dire situation. And the more the public focus on the election and the choice, I think the worse it's going to get for the Prime Minister. He's already behind in the polls. He's already vastly more unpopular than the opposition leader. And I just think it's going to get worse the longer this government lasts. Now, to get back to your question, what does a government have to do to credibly ask for a second term? Well, I think a government has got to have tried seriously to deliver on its promises. It has to be able to say credibly that things on balance have got better on its watch, and it needs to be able to say this is our agenda for a second term. So if we go back to the last government that did get a second term under the same leader, the Howard government in 1998, it hadn't been an easy first term for the Howard government. There'd been quite a few ministerial resignations, often for issues of propriety, rather punctilious application of the rules, had claimed some ministerial scalps. But economically, things certainly were no worse, and in some respects better in 1998 than in 1996. The government had some significant achievements under its belt. The 1996 budget was very important in terms of restoring budget responsibility, fiscal responsibility. There was Peter Reith's workplace relations changes. And of course, there was tax reform. Now, it was a very bold move for the government to go to an election promising major tax reform, particularly as it had gone to the previous election saying that there would never ever be a GST, that it was completely off the agenda. But I think, again, the public looked at John Howard and they said, well, he's changed his mind on the GST and major tax reform, but he's now doing the right thing by asking us to approve it in an election. He is seeking a definite mandate for change. So Albo's not doing any of that. Basically, he's saying elect him so you can have stability and more of the same. But more of the same is not much, certainly not much that's good. It's more taxes, it's more spending, it's more regulation, and it's continued falls in living standards.
So maybe the only way out for Albanese is a big picture idea that would actually get people maybe to forget about the last 3 years and galvanise them around this one big issue and focus the campaign on that one issue and, in essence, make it a referendum on that. Now, I think he's probably looking at childcare or something, but childcare is largely a system that's not working in the interests of your typical family. So I think shoveling more money into that probably isn't going to excite people. So, well, let's talk about one of the key, I guess, policy areas, which is to do with energy policy, and we've talked about that a bit recently. It's given, I guess, a new dimension with industry groups now talking out about it. We've had a major food manufacturing and distribution industry group call out the failure of the current government's policy, saying we need more coal, more gas, more baseload power because costs are going up. So that's a very welcome development. At the same time, you've also got a lot of criticism of the government's 82% emissions cut promised by 2030, which plainly is just not going to happen. It feels to me like the contours of the debate are now being shaped in probably a positive way for those of us who are concerned about the direction of our country. So what's your assessment of how that particular debate is now shaping up?
Look, as we've been discussing for many, many months now, Dan, energy policy in this country is a slow motion train wreck. The only new energy coming into the system is intermittent wind and solar power. We need power 24/7. We can't get that from wind and solar without a massive increase in gas, and that's not happening either. Because of the green predilections of this government and their hostility to new gas developments. So, frankly, we are on a ruinous path right now. I think it's almost certain that without very, very swift change, we will get major blackouts or brownouts in the near future. Just over the last couple of days in Victoria, which hasn't been an extreme heat wave. Sure, it's been hot weather, but we haven't had sustained temperatures in the mid-40s. Yes, we've had a lot of high 30s days, but a real heat wave has temperatures in the high 40s for a week or more on end. So even though this is not particularly extreme weather, we've had rampant warnings of the potential for load shedding, which is code for blackouts. A lot of people who are, in other respects, broadly supportive of the government's direction, such as Rod Sims, the former competition czar, is now out there on the public record saying that for 10 years, governments have shamefully and scandalously, particularly in Victoria, neglected the need for more gas. I mean, the idea that a country which a few years ago was either the world's first or second biggest gas exporter is now desperately trying to create gas import terminals because we haven't developed our own domestic gas resources nearly as quickly as we should have. It's really a national disgrace, an absolute national disgrace. As someone said just recently, the idea of Australia importing gas is like importing sand into the Sahara Desert. I mean, it just should not be necessary. But it's sustained policy failure, particularly over the last 2.5 years, which has got us to this predicament.
I mean, I tend to get the impression now that the public is pretty over the climate debate. I mean, in times gone by, you know, being a climate denier or whatever other epitaph was used as a bit of a cudgel and sometimes with effect. But I don't think people really care about that anymore. I think the public has seen through that in the same way they're seeing through, you know, political correctness and the whole diversity, equity and inclusion and the voice to Parliament, the Australia Day debate. I really think there's a new front that's opened up in that debate that is favourable towards those of us who want a common sense energy policy. Now, I think the coalition's policy is fairly strong, but they could probably do more to, I think, step into that opportunity would be my perspective.
Well, they are saying that there will be the rapid development of new gas fields, and Beetaloo is specifically named as a major gas field to be developed rapidly should there be a change of government. I'd certainly be inclined to say that all of the nitpicking objections and the lawfare which has stopped Narrabri, for instance, being developed in northern New South Wales, and these offshore fields off the coast of Western Australia and the Northern Territory. I mean, these have been studied and litigated endlessly, and there are no significant objections to them. And I think all of those fields should be given the green light. And frankly, I would like to think that the coalition will go into the election seeking a specific mandate for the rapid development of all of these gas fields, in the same way that in 2019, thanks to the good work of Matt Canavan, the government was effectively seeking a mandate to develop the Adani mine. And miraculously, all the objections to the Adani mine seemed to evaporate after Scott Morrison's miracle win in 2019. So I think a similar approach is needed with gas going into this election, because if we don't get more gas into the system very rapidly, either there will be widespread blackouts, or we will have to break contracts, and I don't believe that that's something that any Australian should be calm about.
Well, one of the things that is going to put our feet to the fire is Trump and the Trump administration, who's wasting no time in, you know, essentially trying to deploy its economic leverage to get countries to do what it wants. And, you know, at one level, that's fair enough. And we've seen the tariffs that he's threatened to impose on Canada and Mexico. Now he's given them reprieve because both Canada and Mexico have said, okay, we'll do something about the border and fentanyl and other issues that Trump has had. To me, it really underscores just how powerful the United States is. Obviously, we know about the military strength, but the economic strength of the United States is phenomenal. So I'm interested in your assessment of, I guess, how that's played out so far. I mean, Trump sort of started the tariff war and he's almost already won it in a sense. And then also, what does it mean for Australia? What do we need to be aware of over the coming years?
There's no doubt, as you say, that Trump has begun his second term with enormous energy and considerable force. Considerable force. He is certainly not your standard, predictable, soft centre-right politician. And, you know, we've had too much soft centre-right in recent years. I mean, leaving aside the coalition here in Australia, certainly the British Conservative government, as Kemi Badenoch has admitted, said conservative things, but then did. It talked conservative, but it acted Labor. It talked right, but acted left. And Trump is the polar opposite of that. I mean, he is the enemy of political correctness. he is the enemy of America being taken advantage of by others. And his fundamental position is that for too long the rest of the world has been free riding on the United States. And in important respects this has been true, particularly in defence. There's no doubt that American blood and treasure has kept the rest of the world much freer, much safer, much fairer, much richer than it would otherwise have been. And Trump is saying, very understandably, this must stop. And because the immediate challenge is the disaster, particularly on the southern border, that's why he has threatened both Mexico and Canada with these tariffs. That's why he threatened Colombia with the tariffs, and it worked in Colombia's case. And yes, it seems to have worked in Mexico and Canada's case, with both those countries pledging 10,000 additional troops to ensure that the border is secure, that illegal people and illegal substances don't flood into the United States. And look, frankly, if something that is an affront is going on, I think governments do have to act very, very vigorously. I mean, I can remember back in 2013, I thought it was an absolute affront to us as a sovereign nation that illegal boats were turning up from another country with people demanding permanent residency in Australia. And as you might remember, I said, look, the people smugglers and those who are aiding and abetting them need to get a very clear message. The way is shut. And we stopped the boats by turning them around. And when they were scuttled, we gave their passengers an unsinkable boat that we could send them back in. Now, I was told back then that A, it was impossible, B, it was illegal, and C, it was going to cause conflict, possibly even armed conflict with Indonesia. Well, it was possible, it was legal, at least under the additional legal advice we got, and in the end the Indonesians were happy that we got our house in order, because it meant that they didn't have to host these people indefinitely in their country before they got on a boat to Australia. So sometimes you've got to take very strong action to make a difference, particularly when you're in the presence of a chronic problem which government has found almost impossible to deal with, that governments have been wringing their hands over for years. And when it comes to illegal migration, when it comes to fentanyl and other things going into the United States, drug trafficking and people trafficking, too many governments have wrung their hands impotently for too long, and Trump has said enough is enough. So, look, highly unorthodox. I think it would have been most unfortunate for everyone if these 25% tariffs on goods coming into the United States from Mexico and Canada had been imposed, because Canada in particular is a great friend of the United States. It's not exactly the 51st state, but it's a sort of a sibling country in the same way that Australia and New Zealand are really sibling countries. And you wouldn't want to see anything that was a major rupture between countries that have been so close for so long. But it's had the desired effect. It's got the Canadian government taking seriously its responsibilities on the border, and likewise the Mexican government. Now, I think there's a much stronger case for big tariffs against China, because what's crystal clear now that was not nearly so clear 15 years ago or a decade ago is that China is our very dangerous strategic competitor, and China has exploited free trade, but it hasn't practiced free trade. It's stolen technology, it's subsidised national champions to drive out competition, it's capriciously disrupted trade when it suits it, it's treated trade as politics, geopolitics by other means. I think there does need to be a very significant decoupling between the West and China. I'm not saying that there should be no trade between the West and China. Certainly, I'm happy indeed to see us maximising our commodity exports to China. But what we can't have is a situation where our trading policies enable China to steal a technological march on us, to become much stronger than us relatively in defence and high technology, and where we make ourselves economically and strategically vulnerable to China by having them in critical places in our supply chains. I think all of that has got to be looked at very carefully as a matter of great urgency, and I think that in important respects, high tariffs on Chinese goods entering the United States are no bad thing.
And what about in terms of Australia? Because if you had that situation of the US imposes tariffs on China, you could see actually maybe more of an influx of Chinese goods into Australia as a consequence of that. Would it be wise for Australia to look at erecting some barriers to the entry of Chinese goods into our nation? And I guess one of the challenges there is, as you rightly say, because we are now so dependent, particularly for our exports of raw materials, which is a massive revenue earner. Of course, China could turn around and say, well, we're not taking your iron ore or your coal and so forth. So I think the risks, whilst I totally agree that we need to manufacture more of our own things, I sort of wonder, how do we go about it as a nation? Maybe we pivot more towards India and other developing nations and open up more markets. But just interested in your assessment, should Australia move towards more of a protectionist stance with China?
Well, Dan, look, I just want to make this observation by way of introduction. Back in 2014, when we finalised the Australia-China free trade deal, I was very positive about that, because even then it was easy to think that China was liberalising, and that economic liberalisation, which was still happening in 2014, or still appeared to be happening in 2014, would ultimately lead to political liberalisation as well. So in the context of 2014, I think the Australia-China free trade deal was a good thing to do. I would just make the point that the situation is very, very different now. I'd also make the point that the situation China vis-a-vis the United States economically is quite different from the situation China vis-a-vis Australia economically. We have never had the kind of comprehensive manufacturing base that the United States has. So we have not, free trade between Australia and China has not devastated our manufacturing in the same way that it arguably has the United States, because we didn't have that much manufacturing to start with. And our exports to China are very much commodity exports rather than sophisticated manufactured exports, which can be copied and then sent back. So look, our situation vis-a-vis China is different to that of the United States. I think it makes sense for Trump to look at high tariffs on Chinese imports into America, because it's very important that America rebuild its heavy industrial base. Very important. In our case, I think it makes sense for us to diversify our exports. I think it makes sense for us to diversify our imports, and I think India has the potential to be a substitute for China in many of our supply chains. But I also think what we need to do here in Australia is to have a very sophisticated audit of our national capability. What are the things that we need to be able to make here? What are the things that we should stockpile here if we can't necessarily make them readily, what are the things that we are prepared to rely on our friends for, and what are the things that we are prepared to just rely on the wider world for? And I think that our trading policy needs to be informed by that kind of a significant stock take.
Has any such stock take been done before? Because it sort of seems to me that we've never really had a manufacturing strategy, at least for 20 or 30 years, as far as I can recall.
Well, if you go back to the Hawke government, there was the Button car plan, there was the Button textile plan, but they were industry-specific rather than economy-wide, and they were basically about helping industries that even then were under import pressure to adjust. Back in the Second World War, we had an economic mobilisation around war production, and we were producing, as I understand it, military vehicles, aircraft, ships in very significant numbers in Australia at the time. As late as the 1950s, Michael Pizzullo has been telling us in some of his recent writings, we had a war book. Maybe that's an unfortunate terminology for these times, but my understanding is that the war book talked about the sorts of things that we would need to do at a whole range of different levels in terms of mobilisation for conflict. And my understanding from reading Pizzullo's pieces is that economic and industrial mobilisation was very much a part of that. So there probably are some precedents that we can draw on, and I think we do need to be doing this as a matter of some urgency, because as Israel discovered on October the 7th, 2023, as the Ukrainians discovered on the 24th of February 2022, as the Taiwanese could discover sometime in the next few years, storms can come out of a pretty clear sky, and when they come, you've got to know exactly what to do, and you've got to have plans in place to get that done.
Well, Tony, I think we'll leave it there for today's discussion. So thank you as always for your time and your insights, and we'll keep the chat going over the coming weeks and months.
I look forward to it, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.